Welcome to day 10 of our daily Bible reading. Today we're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 25 to 26, Psalm number 6, and Luke chapter 10. In Genesis, we finally come to the end of Abraham's life, and we read about how Abraham has died and is buried next to his first wife, Sarah. The final section of Abraham's story is an odd little piece where it goes through Ishmael's family tree. But it ends with a really strange little sentence. Ishmaelites didn't get along with any of their kin. Now, this seems like a major dig at the people who are the descendants of Ishmael. And one of the things that I want us to consider and to be mindful of as we read through here, and especially as we get into 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles and some of the prophets, is that there are moments when the humanity of the people who are writing the Bible kind of seeps through. And I think this is one of those places where we get a little peek at the difficult relationships between some of the people who are living near each other in this area of the world. The descendants of Isaac and the descendants of Ishmael don't get along. And of course, the descendants of Isaac are the ones who are writing the Hebrew Bible. If we read through some of the Muslim scriptures and writings, we get a different image and understanding of Ishmael and his descendants. And so we have to keep in mind that there were actual humans that were writing this down. It was not just dictated by God. And there are moments when we get glimpses of some of the realities of the relationships at that time. As we continue in Genesis, Isaac is 40 years old when he gets married to Rebekah, who is the sister of Laban. This is an important little detail to remember because Laban's going to show up again later in Genesis. So it's good to remember who he is. He is the brother of Rebekah. Rebekah, just like Sarah, is having fertility issues. There's a number of women recorded in the Hebrew Bible who have had fertility issues. Some of this is in there because it's a way of showing how people were faithful to God and depended on God to provide things in their lives, especially children, to continue their family line. In this case, Isaac is faithfully praying to God, and God intervenes, and Rebekah is blessed with twins. Now, once again, just as Isaac and Ishmael are not always getting along, the twins, even from their time in the womb, are not getting along well with each other. These are Esau, who's the firstborn, and Jacob, who's the secondborn. Jacob goes on to be the more important and more prominent of the brothers, even though he is the secondborn. And as we read through the story of Jacob, I want you to be paying attention for the moments when Jacob is a bit of a trickster, where he's doing some manipulation. Jacob is a guy, he's one of the patriarchs of the faith, but he is someone of mixed character. There are moments when he has deep faithfulness to God and deep connection to God, but there are also times when he is really kind of manipulating people for his own advantage. And I think sometimes we have an opportunity to learn more from the people who are struggling in their faith life and struggling with their character. And I think we get more insight into then some of the struggles that we have. Now, Isaac, just like his father Abraham, faces a time of famine in the area that he's been living, and he and his family end up having to move. And just like his father, he ends up seeking refuge with King Abimelech. Now, if you remember, there are two times when Abraham uses a little device to try to protect himself of trying to pass his wife off as his sister. And Isaac, I don't know if he knows about these things that Isaac did or that his father Abraham did, but Isaac tries the same trick on King Abimelech, and he tries to let everyone know that Rebekah is his sister and not his wife. The king eventually catches on and sees the two of them showing some affection to each other. And just as before, God is not happy with this, and neither is the king. And eventually the king sends Isaac on his way. So I think it is odd how the men keep going back to this device, but I think it also gives us insight into the risks involved, that when you are a marginalized person who is dealing with famine, who is having to move because of the weather. Does this sound familiar to anything going on in our lives these days? Sometimes we have to make some tough decisions on how we behave as a way of trying to protect ourselves and our families. And as we are facing the migration of many people because of the climate changing in our world today, I think we need to think both about the times when we might be forced to move, but also how are we welcoming other people who are moving? Are we aware of their vulnerabilities, and are we offering safety and security for them, or are we adding to the stress and danger in their lives? Another thing to keep in mind here is that when God sent Abraham to the promised land and promised that he would have a new nation living in this area, there were people already living here. And throughout the Hebrew Bible, as we see people coming and going and moving in different places, we keep seeing how they are bumping up against people who are already living there. There are all sorts of political dynamics going on. For example, here we've got King Abimelech. The Israelites are not in an empty land. This is not their land first. They are people that are moving in there, and they are having to juggle how to get along with their neighbors. And I think this is something for us to remember. I think a lot of times we have this idea that Israel is the chosen people of God, and they are. God chose Abraham, and God chose to work through the descendants of Abraham. But that does not mean that everything was handed to them on a platter. They still had very difficult things they had to deal with. They still had empires that came through and oppressed them. God was not looking to choose the wealthiest, most powerful people. This is not the God of the Pharaohs. This is not the God of the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Persians. This is the God of regular people who are just trying to work and get by. And sometimes they are blessed and they have large crops and flocks, and there are other times that they really struggle. And I think there is a lot for us to capture from this dynamic, that God is more often on the side of the people who are struggling than God is on the side of the people who are powerful and secure. And so if we are feeling secure and comfortable, we need to be careful that we are still faithful to God in our prosperity, and that we are reaching out and sharing the resources that God has blessed us with the people who are not feeling prosperous, so that everyone has enough to be able to have a vibrant and thriving life. Moving on to Psalm 6. This is a psalm that is more of a lamentation. It is a prayer that is sharing the difficulties of life with God, asking for God's help. This is a prayer that has been used as a daily prayer by many people for generations, for centuries. In the Jewish Study Bible, they point out, because at the end of this prayer, there's the line of, God, please keep me alive, because if I'm dead, I can't sing your praises. And the Study Bible points out that biblical Israel, at the time this psalm was written, did not have a tradition about an afterlife that either was a reward or a punishment. So the person who's writing this has a belief, has a tradition that this life is all there is. And when they die, there is no idea that they're going to be in heaven singing with the angelic chorus God's praises for all of time. The praises are going to die when they die, and life ends at death in this situation. And I think what we should be looking at when we read this psalm is, how much have we been thinking about what's going to happen when we die, and making sure that we're right with God at the moment we show up at the pearly gates. Whereas the psalm writer here is thinking about, am I right with God today, in this hour? Am I connected to God? Am I seeing God? Am I being in God's presence every day of my life? I think this is an important thing for us to remember. And our final reading today is Luke 10. And once again, we've got Jesus and some journeys going on. In this case, Jesus is sending 70 of his followers. Some of the other Gospels say 72. He sends them out 2 by 2. No one's going alone. They're all going out in pairs. Jesus points out that there's a lot of work to be done, and there really aren't enough people to do the work. So he suggests that the disciples, his followers, pray for more helpers. This made me think about our prayers these days. How often are we praying for our own personal self, our own personal family, our personal wants, needs, desires? And how often are we praying for the body of the church? For all the work that Jesus has placed before us, are we praying that the Holy Spirit develops and brings to us more people to help us build up God's kingdom, a kingdom of mercy and justice here on earth as it is in heaven? Going on in verse 12, Jesus warns about those who hear and see but don't believe. This is a theme that Jesus has brought up previously. We saw the story about the blind man who was healed, and we talked about what is it that we are blind to in our life. And once again, Jesus is reminding us that sometimes Jesus is telling us things and showing us things, and we are not seeing them and we are not hearing them. We are not paying attention. And more importantly, we are not putting his teachings into action in our life. I think this is a very challenging passage for us to consider every day. The next section is what is often called the Great Commandment. In the Hebrew Bible, there's over 600 commandments, rules, laws, traditions that the Jewish people were expected to follow. And one of the people who is following Jesus now is debating with him, arguing with him, trying to maybe try to trip him up somehow, but also try to get a little more clarity on just what it is that Jesus is trying to get at. And Jesus shares what is called the Great Commandment. He tries to he does boil down all these 600 commandments into one statement. And in the Native American New Testament translation, they put it this way, which I think is a really rich way for us to understand this. They say, Jesus says, love the Great Spirit from deep within, with the strength of your arms, the thoughts of your mind, and the courage of your heart. The strength of our arms, the thoughts of our minds, the courage of our hearts. And then to love our neighbors as we love for ourselves. Jesus says this takes all of the commandments and puts them into one bundle. We love God with every part of our being and all the resources that God has given us, and we love our neighbors as we love ourselves. And I think if many of us put this at the forefront of our minds as we go through our days, it helps us both love our neighbors more, but also helps us stay focused on the holy and the divine in our lives through our relationship with God. This great commandment then is followed up with the very insightful question of who then is my neighbor? And Jesus goes on to the Great Samaritan story. And in this story, there's a guy who's just minding his own business. He's traveling along a country road, going from one town to the next, and he is robbed, he is beaten up, and he is left for dead along the side of the road. Along comes a Jewish priest who ignores the guy. Along comes a Jewish religious authority, another important, prominent leader who also passes by. Now, there may be reasons for this, and they may have been considered legitimate reasons at the moment, but the person that Jesus lifts up is the next guy who shows up. And the Native American Bible describes this person as not a tribal member, so not a Jewish person, a person of mixed blood and despised. This is how the Jewish people described Samaritans. Now, Samaritans are a little bit like the Hatfields and McCoys. They lived very close to the Jewish people. They believed in the same God. They had many of the same rituals, but they had a few tweaks that were a little different. The Samaritans did not go to the temple in Jerusalem to worship God. They went to a mountaintop. There were a few other little things that were a little different, and the two groups did not get along at all. So for Jesus to lift up a Samaritan as the role model for how to love a neighbor was really kind of tweaking the Jewish people that he was talking to at the time. For us listening to this today, the description of a Samaritan doesn't mean much to us, but I do think Jesus is challenging us to think about who are the people that we despise, who are the people that we're uncomfortable with, and that we try to walk away from and ignore, and that perhaps there are people that are not a part of our life that we should be looking to for role models of how we should be engaging with the world, and who are the people who are in need of mercy and justice ministries that we need to stop walking around and start engaging with so that we can care for them and meet their needs. I hope this has been helpful for you, and I look forward to seeing you on day 11.